So, if you break a bone, an X-ray gives you this really clean binary answer. I mean, it's either broken or it's not, right?
You just look at the film.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
see that jagged white line on the black film, the doctor points to it, and you just have instant clarity. And we love that kind of precision.
Oh, absolutely. We're totally conditioned to want those static, clear snapshots of reality.
But, well, what happens when you try to X-ray the history of God talking to humanity?
Yeah, you definitely don't get a snapshot there.
No, not at all. You can't just look at a cross-section of ancient texts and get a clean binary answer. Instead, you're looking at a living, growing organism.
Which is a very different kind of study.
Right, which brings us to our mission today. I want you, the listener, to imagine reading a book, but you aren't allowed to look at its logical chapters.
No table of contents.
Right, no table of contents, no index. Instead, you are tasked with watching a seed organically grow into this massive, sprawling oak tree over, centuries.
That's quite an assignment.
It is. You have to watch the roots push through the soil, observe the trunk widen, and map exactly how the branches splinter off. So, welcome to the deep dive.
Glad to be here.
Today, we are exploring excerpts from a monumental, dense, and highly influential work. It's Geerhardus Vos's Biblical Theology.
It is definitely a dense one.
Oh, incredibly dense. Our goal is to track what he calls the organic history of special revelation, starting right from the soil of the Garden of Eden.
Tracing those roots right up to the era of Moses.
Exactly. But before we start digging into that soil, we need to set some ground rules.
Yes, it is absolutely crucial that we establish the framework for our discussion today, because the text we're analyzing contains some incredibly strong, very specific theological viewpoints.
It's not a neutral textbook.
Not at all. Vos is not writing in a vacuum. He is actively engaging in heavy, highly academic combat with rationalist and critical historians of his era.
People like the Wellhausen School.
Right, exactly. The Wellhausen school of thought, which championed a much more evolutionary view of religious history. So we need to make it explicitly clear to you right now, we are acting strictly as impartial guides through this material.
We are not taking sides.
No, we're not endorsing the specific religious or theological views of the author, nor are we adopting the secular perspectives of his critics.
Right, we're just the tour guides in the Museum of Ideas today.
Exactly. Our job is simply to unpack the architecture of these fascinating arguments exactly as they're presented in the source material, so you can understand the mechanics of the debate.
So let's start with the name on the building itself, the term biblical theology. For an outsider, or, really anyone casually familiar with religion, those two words sound totally redundant.
They do sound like they mean the exact same thing.
Yeah, it sounds like a generic term for just studying religion. But Vos insists that biblical theology is a highly specialized discipline.
He places it in direct contrast to systematic theology.
Right. And if I'm understanding his premise correctly, systematic theology is like a botanist categorizing the leaves, the branches, and the roots by their cellular type.
Yes, looking at the pieces.
But biblical theology is like pulling up a chair and watching the acorn actually grow into the oak tree.
That analogy captures his methodology perfectly. I mean, systematic theology is fundamentally logical and topical.
It's organized.
Exactly. It takes the Bible as a completed, closed, whole, finished product and organizes it like an encyclopedia.
Like, what does the whole Bible say about sin?
Right. It asks, what is the comprehensive doctrine of God? What is the comprehensive doctrine of sin? But biblical theology organizes the material historically.
It's obsessed with the timeline.
Totally obsessed. It asks, how did this specific concept unfold from its primitive initial form to its final form? It's the study of the process of repetition rather than the final product.
And what's crucial here, and where I think a lot of modern readers get totally tripped up, is how Vos views those early primitive stages.
Oh, modern bias is strong there.
Yeah, because we assume early means flawed. We assume a Model T Ford is an imperfect car compared to a modern Tesla.
Right, it's just an early draft.
But Vos emphasizes that an acorn isn't an imperfect tree, it is a perfect seed form.
Yes, that is so important.
It contains the absolute minimum indispensable knowledge, perfectly suited for the environment it exists in at that exact moment.
Precisely. And that is the core of his organic view. When analyzing the progress of ancient revelation, the critical historians of Vos' day often looked back at the early stages and categorized them as primitive.
Or barbarous.
Right, barbarous or mythological attempts at understanding the world, which only later evolved into refined philosophical truth.
Like going from cave paintings to the Renaissance.
Exactly. The Wellhausen school essentially argued that Israelite religion evolved from animism to polytheism to monotheism.
But Vos totally rejects that.
Completely rejects that evolutionary model. His organic seed form view argues that the truth delivered at any given historical stage is qualitatively perfect.
Even if it's small.
Yes. Just as a seed is complete and perfect in its seed nature before it becomes a tree, the early revelations were perfectly sufficient and uncorrupted for the people of that time.
So, if we are going to understand how this seed grows, we have to look at the environment it was planted in.
The soil.
Right, the soil. We have to look at how God actually initiates contact with humanity in this text. Because according to Vos, God doesn't just, shout abstract truths from the clouds.
He sets up very rigid relational structures.
And the foundation of all of this is the concept of the covenant. Let's look at the mechanics of this word, because the etymology alone reveals a massive theological debate.
Oh, the etymology is a deep dive all on its own. So in the Hebrew Old Testament, the word used is berith.
Berith, okay.
And in our modern context, when we hear the word covenant, we almost instantly map it onto a contract.
Like signing a lease.
Right. We think of a bilateral agreement, a negotiated settlement between two equal parties. But berith doesn't inherently mean a negotiated agreement. No. Vos points out that the defining characteristic of a berith is that it is an unalterable, eternally valid arrangement that is sanctioned by religion.
That's not flexible.
Not at all. The emphasis is entirely on its fixed certainty, not on it being some mutual compromise.
It's not two corporate executives haggling over a merger where they meet in the middle. It's a sovereign decree.
The top-down decree.
And this creates a massive linguistic crisis later on, right? When Jewish scholars in Alexandria were translating the Hebrew text into Greek, creating the Septuagint.
Yes, they faced a profound translation dilemma.
Because they had to find a Greek equivalent for berith.
And they were totally backed into a corner. The most logical, common Greek word for a mutual agreement or contract was syntheke.
Syntheke.
But syntheke strongly implies a co-equality between the two parties making the deal.
Which is a huge problem.
A massive problem.
Yeah.
The translators recognized that using syntheke would completely undermine the theology of the text, which is predicated on God's absolute supremacy.
God and humanity are not peers sitting across a negotiating table.
Exactly. So they threw syntheke out.
But the alternative they choose seems almost absurd on its face. They pick the word diatheke.
Which is a very strange choice at first glance.
Right, because in the Hellenistic world at the time, diatheke was almost exclusively used to mean a last will and testament.
A literal will for a dead person.
Wait, if the translators knew diatheke meant a will, and they're writing about an immortal God, aren't they basically introducing a massive theological paradox just to avoid a word that implies equality?
It seems incredibly risky.
Yeah. How does that make sense?
Well, it does seem like a glaring paradox if you analyze it strictly through the lens of Roman law, where a testament only takes effect upon the death of the testator.
Right.
But Vos provides two critical pieces of context to explain this. First, under the Greco-Syrian law prevalent in that region at the time, a testament did not actually require the death of the person making it.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it was understood as an irrevocable disposition of property made during one's lifetime.
Okay, that helps.
And second, and more importantly, the translators were leaning heavily on an older, more archaic, generic meaning of diatheke.
What did that older meaning imply?
It simply meant a sovereign disposition. It described a unilateral arrangement dictated by a superior for an inferior.
Wow, okay.
So they willingly absorbed the awkwardness of the testament association because it was the literally only way to avoid the heresy of the equal partner association found in syntheke.
That is fascinating. So the entire architecture of how humans relate to God in this text hinges on the avoidance of equality.
It is a top-down sovereign disposition.
So holding on to this framework of an unalterable arrangement, let's examine the very first structural setup in the text Eden.
Right, what Vos refers to as the preredemptive revelation.
Preredemptive, meaning it's the baseline, before anyone has fallen, before anything needs redeeming.
Exactly. And Eden isn't described merely as a lush botanical garden.
No, it's framed as a sanctuary.
And in the center of this sanctuary, we have these two massive physical symbols.
The tree of life and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Let's isolate the tree of life first.
According to Vos's analysis, the tree of life symbolizes life in its highest potency.
Meaning what, exactly?
It represents an eschatological communion with God. Now, we should define eschatological carefully here, because it doesn't just mean the end of the world in the apocalyptic sense.
Right, no zombies or meteors.
Exactly. In this theological framework, it relates to the telos, the ultimate, intended final destiny of humanity.
The finish line.
The core idea is that humanity was not created in its final unchangeable state. Man was created morally good, but he was placed in a state of probation.
A probationary period, like a new employee who hasn't been granted tenure yet.
That's a great way to look at it. If humanity passed this probation, they would be elevated to a confirmed permanent state where they could no longer sin and therefore could no longer die.
So the tree of life was the prize.
Yes, it was the sacramental symbol, the tangible seal of that future unlosable life.
Which explains why humanity hadn't eaten from it yet. It was the trophy waiting at the finish line.
But to get to the finish line, you have to run the obstacle course.
And the probation itself was centered entirely on the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Now, I have to stop and ask the question that secular historians and anthropologists constantly raise about this narrative.
The mythological comparison.
Yeah, was this tree of knowledge just a magical fruit? Because structurally, this sounds exactly like the pagan myths of antiquity, where the gods jealously hid fire or knowledge from humans.
To keep them subservient.
Exactly. It sounds like a variation of Prometheus.
It is a very common comparative anthropology argument. But Vos spends significant academic energy dismantling that exact mythological comparison.
How does he break it down?
He argues that if you look closely at the internal logic of the Genesis text, the pagan myth parallel completely falls apart. In pagan myths, the gods are genuinely threatened by human advancement.
Right, humans get fire, and suddenly Zeus is worried.
Exactly. But in this text, God himself intentionally plants the tree right in the absolute center of the garden.
You don't put the one thing that can overthrow you in the center of the room.
Precisely. Furthermore, after humanity eats the fruit and gains this knowledge, God's superiority is never in question.
He's not scrambling to defend the throne.
No. He remains absolutely sovereign and dictates the consequences. The pagan mythology requires a deity who is insecure and vulnerable to human evolution. The God of this text is not.
So if it's not a magical piece of fruit that artificially boosts your intellect, what does the knowledge of good and evil actually mean in this specific Hebrew context?
Vos argues that in this context, knowledge signifies ethical maturity.
Ethical maturity.
The grammatical phrasing implies knowing good and evil as correlated, mutually conditioned concepts. It was God's intention for humanity to attain this maturity.
So he wanted them to have it eventually.
Yes. The name of the tree does not imply that the knowledge itself was inherently forbidden or evil. The tree was simply the instrument of the test.
Oh, I see.
Humanity could attain this ethical maturity in a good way by obeying the command and realizing the stark contrast between the good they actively chose and the evil they rejected.
Or they could attain it in a bad way.
Exactly. By experiencing the evil firsthand through disobedience.
Okay, but that leads to a massive question about the nature of the rule itself. Why the completely arbitrary rule, like, don't eat from this one specific botanical specimen?
It does seem random.
If the goal is ethical maturity, why not test them with a moral rule? Why not say, don't murder each other or don't steal? Why use a command that has no inherent moral logic to it?
That's a really valid question.
Because from a human perspective, an arbitrary rule feels tyrannical. If a boss tells me don't touch this specific blue stapler just because I said so, I don't feel ethically tested.
You feel resentful.
Exactly. How does Vos justify God acting like that?
That is a brilliant pushback, and it gets the absolute core of what Vos argues is happening here. If we look at the mechanics of the test, an arbitrary command is actually the only way to conduct a pure test of allegiance.
A pure test.
Think about it. If the command was don't murder, human instinct, empathy, or basic social logic might prevent the act.
You might abstain from murder simply because it disrupts social harmony.
Right. If you obey a moral law, you might just be obeying your own internal logic.
Oh, wow. I see. It muddies the variables of the experiment.
Exactly. An arbitrary command removes instinct and logic from the equation entirely. It tests one variable and one variable only.
Will humanity choose obedience purely out of a personal, loving attachment to the lawgiver?
Yes. Will they submit simply because God asked them to, even when the command makes no logical sense to their immediate desires? It isolates pure allegiance.
It isolates the variable of authority. That fundamentally changes how you read the story.
It's not about an apple.
No, it's about who gets to define reality. Which brings us to the breakdown of this perfect system. If Eden is the pristine laboratory for this probation, the introduction of the serpent represents the ultimate contamination of the experiment.
The variable that ruins the test.
Right. Let's look at how this disruption actually worked, because the text's psychological breakdown of the temptation is terrifyingly relevant even today. How does the serpent dismantle human allegiance?
It is a masterclass in psychological manipulation and subversion. Vos outlines how the temptation is executed in two highly distinct, calculated stages.
Stage 1.
The first stage is all about injecting factual doubt regarding God's benevolence. The serpent asks, "Yea, hath God said, Ye shall not eat of every tree of the garden?"
It's a subtle but profound twist.
Very subtle. The serpent takes a radically generous arrangement. I mean, they could eat from literally thousands of trees, and frames it as a sweeping, oppressive restriction.
He doesn't start by calling God a liar. That would trigger their defensive instincts.
Right. He just asks a clarifying question that frames God as stingy.
But it's the woman's response that reveals the true psychological damage. She corrects him, but in doing so, she says they can't eat of the tree, neither shall ye touch it.
And that addition is the critical tell.
Because God never said that.
Neither shall ye touch it was never part of the original divine command. By adding that physical restriction, she reveals her internal psychological state.
She is already beginning to feel that God's rules are too harsh.
Too suffocating. She has entertained the seed of resentment. She's viewing the sovereign disposition not as a loving boundary, but as a cage.
And once that door of resentment is cracked open, the serpent immediately moves to stage 2.
Which is the full frontal assault on God's character.
Right. Ye shall not surely die. For God doth know that in the day ye eat thereof, then your eyes shall be opened, and ye shall be as gods.
This is where the fatal psychological swap occurs. Vos points out that the woman virtually replaces God with the serpent in her mind.
She assumes that God has malicious, selfish intentions.
That he is deliberately holding her back out of divine envy. And she simultaneously assumes the serpent has her best interests at heart.
Which is wild. She switches her allegiance based entirely on a fabricated narrative about God's character.
She buys into the idea that God is a rival to human flourishing, rather than the source of it.
So they eat, they fail the probation, and the curse comes down. The principle of death is introduced into the human experience.
And here, Vos wades into a very deep philosophical debate about human mortality.
Because a lot of modern secular thinkers operate on the assumption that man is biologically just another animal, so of course he was created naturally mortal.
Death is just cellular decay.
Right. But Vos pushes back aggressively against the idea that death was man's original natural state.
He does. And to clarify the biblical view against both philosophy and modern biology, Vos categorizes immortality into 3 distinct types.
Okay, let's break those down.
First, he identifies philosophical immortality. This is the idea that the soul inherently persists after the body dissolves. The text assumes humans always possess this. The soul doesn't just cease to exist.
Okay, the soul is eternal. What's the second?
Second, there is theological immortality. This means being created with no internal disease, no biological ticking clock, and no natural mechanism of death.
Well, though one could theoretically still be killed by an overwhelming outside force, right?
Exactly. You're not invincible, but you aren't decaying. And third, there is eschatological immortality, which is absolute, confirmed immunity to death.
The prize of the tree of life.
Yes.
So Adam and Eve, prior to the fall, possessed that second type, theological immortality.
Right.
They weren't ticking time bombs of cellular decay, but they weren't entirely bulletproof either. They were in a state of suspended physical neutrality.
Correct. And therefore, the curse of death wasn't just a natural biological event that finally caught up to them. It was an active penal intrusion.
A punishment.
Yes. Vos deeply analyzes the phrasing of the curse. Dust thou art, and unto dust shalt thou return. He argues that this statement doesn't mean death is man's natural destiny because he is made of dust.
Then what does it mean?
It dictates the specific physical form the punishment of death will take. Because humanity was formed from the dust, the penal curse will manifest as a grueling return to that exact material state.
Brought on by the exhaustion of laboring against a newly cursed earth?
Exactly. The punishment fits the material origin.
Yeah. But right in the middle of these devastating cosmic curses, we get what theologians refer to as the proto-evangelium, the first gospel.
Hidden right in the middle.
Right in the middle of the curse aimed at the serpent. God says, I will put enmity between thee and the woman, and between thy seed and her seed. It shall bruise thy head, and thou shalt bruise his heel.
This is perhaps the most monumental pivot point in the entire text. First, we must notice the divine initiative. God declares, "I will put enmity."
Remember, humanity had just willingly allied itself with the serpent in a rebellion against God.
Right, they were on the same team.
And God, in an act of pure sovereign grace, steps in and unilaterally shatters that unholy alliance. He creates an artificial hostility between humanity and the kingdom of evil.
This implanted enmity is the first spark of redemptive victory.
And the linguistic detail here is incredibly precise. The Hebrew word shuf is used for both actions in the second half of the verse.
But the outcome of the action is totally asymmetrical.
Yes. The seed of the woman will crush or bruise the head of the serpent, which is a fatal blow. But the serpent will only strike or bruise the heel of the woman's seed.
A painful, venomous, but not ultimately victorious wound.
This asymmetry establishes the blueprint for the entire trajectory of the text's redemptive history.
It prophesies a collective, agonizing human struggle against the collective kingdom of evil.
Culminating in a definitive, fatal victory over evil, though it will come at a great cost to the victor.
Exactly.
So, if the serpent seed and the woman's seed are now locked in a perpetual, multi-generational war, how does that actually play out in human history?
What happens when these two ideologies start building societies?
Exactly. This brings us to the generational compounding of sin. The text explicitly splits early humanity into two distinct family trees, the descendants of Cain and the descendants of Seth. Let's examine the Cainites first.
Because their sociological development feels staggeringly modern.
It really does. The Cainite line is characterized by explosive technological and cultural development.
The text identifies them as the builders of the first cities,
The pioneers of cattle raising.
the inventors of complex music, and the masters of metalworking.
But Vos is quick to point out the dark irony here, isn't he?
He is. This massive progress in the secular cultural sphere is accompanied by a severe, accelerating degeneration in the moral sphere.
It's the ultimate historical example of technological advancement vastly outpacing moral advancement. We see this today.
We have smartphones and artificial intelligence, but we still fight wars over resources and ego.
Right. The Cainites weaponized what theologians call common grace,
That's the baseline set of gifts God gives to all humanity.
like intellect, creativity, the ability to manipulate the environment. And the absolute poster child for the weaponization of common grace is Lamech, a direct descendant of Cain.
Lamech is a fascinating and terrifying psychological case study in the text. He's the author of what is known as the Sword Song.
What's the sword song?
He essentially writes a piece of arrogant poetry to his wives, boasting about killing a man merely for wounding him, and a young man simply for striking him.
Just totally disproportionate revenge.
Exactly. Vos analyzes this as the climax of secular humanism weaponized. Lamech is completely devoid of any sense of sin, remorse, or need for divine justice.
He relies entirely on human vengeance and his newly invented metal swords to dictate his reality.
He also introduces polygamy.
Right, deliberately twisting the original design of marriage to serve his own ego and lust for power.
He's the ancient equivalent of a billionaire tech bro who gets the newest military contract and immediately uses it to establish a violent monopoly.
He's untouchable. Now contrast that hyperproductivity with the Sethite lineage.
The Sethites are presented in stark contrast. They're not recorded as great inventors, city builders, or artists.
What is their crowning achievement?
It is entirely religious and relational. They are the preservers of the redemptive line. The contrast reaches its absolute peak in the 7th generation from Adam.
While the Cainites produce the arrogant, violent, self-worshipping Lamech, the Sethites produce Enoch.
Right, and the text famously says, Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him.
The phrase walking with God denotes a supernatural, intimate, continuous communion, right? Essentially restoring the fellowship that was lost in Eden.
Yes, and his translation, the fact that he physically escapes death and is taken by God, proclaims a massive theological principle.
Which is?
Where true communion with God is restored, deliverance from the curse of death naturally follows.
But the Sethites don't stay isolated in their pious communes forever, and this leads to what is arguably one of the most fiercely debated passages in the entire book of Genesis.
The intermingling.
Yes, the text states that the sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them as wives. Now, there's a massive academic and theological debate here.
It's huge debate.
Many critical scholars and even some ancient Jewish traditions argue that this is a mythological, supernatural tale about fallen angels.
Angels coming down to earth and mating with human women to create a race of giants.
And they point directly to the book of Jude in the New Testament to back this up.
It is a major point of contention in biblical studies. The argument for the angel theory relies heavily on the book of Jude, where angels are described as having left their proper domain.
And their sin is explicitly compared to the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah giving themselves over to strange flesh.
Which suggests a crossing of species boundaries. But Vos, the author of our source text, aggressively rejects the angel theory in the context of Genesis.
Why is he so opposed to it? If it's a common ancient view, what is his specific logical counterargument against the angel theory?
Vos argues that injecting extraterrestrial or angelic beings into this specific chapter completely ruins the organic logical flow of the narrative.
How so?
Well, the entire point of the preceding chapters was meticulously tracking the development of human sin. The narrative painstakingly set up the tension between the pious Sethites and the wicked Cainites. If you suddenly introduce fallen angels as the primary cause of the final corruption, it is no longer a story about human depravity reaching its natural tragic climax.
It becomes a story of humanity being victimized by an outside supernatural force.
Exactly. Vos insists that interpreting the sons of God as the pious Sethites and the daughters of men as the secular worldly Cainite women maintains the moral integrity of the story.
So the tragedy is that the holy line allowed itself to be assimilated by the wicked line through intermarriage.
Lured by physical beauty, leading to total global corruption.
It's the collapse of the moral firewall. The Sethites trade their spiritual heritage for the cultural and physical allure of the Cainites, and humanity reaches terminal velocity in its corruption.
So God hits the breaking point.
He declares that his spirit will not always strive with man, and he sets a hard physical limit of 120 years before the flood comes. And after this global reset, this washing of the earth, we arrive at the Noachian covenant.
The covenant of nature.
This covenant is unique in the biblical timeline because its primary focus isn't specifically about spiritual redemption, is it?
No, it's about stabilizing the natural physical order so that the long process of redemption can actually take place on a stable stage.
God promises never to curse the ground in that specific way or destroy all life by a flood again. He formally institutes the regularity of seasons, seed time and harvest, cold and heat.
And as the seal of this natural covenant, he gives the sign of the rainbow.
Now, I have to point out a detail here that I always found striking. In Sunday school, we always teach kids that the rainbow is there so we remember God's promise not to flood the earth.
Right, that's the common Sunday school lesson.
But the text frames it quite differently. It uses anthropomorphic symbolism, giving God human characteristics.
God says the bow will be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant.
It's explicitly framed as a reminder for God himself.
It's a remarkably bold use of anthropomorphism. By portraying God as needing a visual reminder, the text emphasizes the absolute, unshakable sureness of the promise.
It's a rhetorical device.
It's as if God is saying, even if divine mind could somehow forget, this physical sign will compel me to remember. It anchors human security in God's self-imposed obligation.
But we should also note that alongside this grace in nature, God institutes a severe new law to protect human life in this new era.
Capital punishment for murder.
Right. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. And Vos makes a very specific philosophical point about why this law is instituted here.
It isn't just a pragmatic deterrent.
Exactly. Vos is explicit that this is not merely a utilitarian measure designed to maintain social order in a newly forming society.
The law is based squarely and explicitly on the fact that man is made in the image of God.
To assault, degrade, or destroy human life is to directly assault the divine majesty reflected in that life.
It elevates the value of human life to a sacred, inviolable level, making its destruction a direct crime against the Creator himself, demanding the ultimate reciprocal penalty.
So the physical stage of nature is stabilized. The world isn't going to be wiped out by water again, but human nature hasn't changed.
Humanity is still fundamentally humanity.
And as they multiply, they prove at the Tower of Babel that if they remain totally united, they will simply build massive, centralized empires of rebellion.
So God disperses them by confusing their languages.
And at this point in the text, the narrative lens zooms way, way in. We transition from dealing with the macro history of the whole world to God electing one single specific family.
The Shemites, and ultimately Abraham.
Why the Shemites? Did they do something to earn it?
According to Vos, it wasn't about earning it through moral perfection. It was about possessing a specific providential mental framework.
Vos contrasts the Shemites with other ancient cultures, like the Japhethites or Hamites.
Yes, who were highly productive, restless, active, and prone to pantheism, the blending of God with nature.
And the Shemites.
The Shemites, on the other hand, possessed a more passive, receptive mentality. Their culture emphasized deep submission to the deity and what Vos calls tribal monolatry.
Tribal monolatry. What does that mean?
It's the intense, exclusive personal worship of one specific god by a specific tribe, even if they believed other gods existed for other nations.
It's as if God engineered their culture to have the exact right receiver dish built into it so they could catch the specific frequency of revelation he was about to broadcast.
That's a great way to picture it.
But before we get into the life of Abraham, we have to address the massive elephant in the academic room. The pushback from the secular historians we mentioned earlier.
Specifically, the Wellhausen critical school.
Because these critics argue that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob weren't even real historical people.
This is a foundational debate in biblical theology, and it dominated the 19th and early 20th century German academy.
So what was their theory?
The Wellhausen school operated on a theory that these patriarchal figures were essentially literary inventions. The theory suggests that they were either personifications of ancient nomadic tribes, meaning Abraham is just a shorthand metaphor for a group of people moving from Mesopotamia to Canaan, or that they were repurposed Canaanite demigods.
Repurposed demigods.
The hypothesis was that when the Israelites eventually conquered Canaan, they took over the local pagan shrines at Hebron, Beersheba, and Bethel, adopted the local deities worshipped there, and later scrubbed the mythology to make these gods look like their own human ancestors.
Okay, so the critics say it's all back-engineered propaganda. As an impartial guide through Vos's work, how does he vigorously dismantle that theory? Because he doesn't just dismiss it, he attacks the logic of it.
Vos dismantles the critical theory point by point, relying on internal textual evidence. First, he points out a glaring absence.
Which is?
If the patriarchs were formerly Canaanite gods, you would expect to see remnants of cultic worship directed at them in later Israelite history.
Yeah.
But the Israelites never worshipped the patriarchs.
They reverence them, but there is zero trace of altars built to Abraham or sacrifices made to Jacob.
Exactly. Second, he looks at linguistics. The name Abraham is never used in the Old Testament as a plural tribal name. It is always used to denote a specific individual.
When they speak of the tribe, they say Israel or the children of Israel.
Right. And third, he points to the psychology of national myth-making.
This is my favorite part.
If these stories were just later national self-idealizations, ancient propaganda invented by the Israelites to make themselves look glorious and divinely ordained, why do the patriarchs have such profound, embarrassing moral flaws?
That's the strongest point to me. If you are inventing a flawless national founder to legitimize your empire, you don't make him a coward.
No, you definitely don't.
Abraham literally passes his wife off as his sister twice because he's afraid of getting killed. Jacob is a literal con artist who manipulates his blind father.
The raw, unvarnished depiction of their sins and weaknesses strongly argues for historical authenticity.
You don't invent those details if you're writing propaganda.
Precisely. Vos argues that the psychological realism of their flaws is the greatest proof that the Israelites were recording historical traditions, not inventing theological fairy tales.
Okay, I want to pivot and explore something else in this section that I find structurally fascinating. The progression of God's names.
Yes.
In this patriarchal period, we see God revealing himself through different titles, and each one adds a new layer of meaning to how humans understand him. We start with El.
El is the oldest and most common Shemitic name for the deity across the ancient Near East. It derives from a linguistic root meaning strength or dynamic outgoing power.
It signifies the one who is strong.
The leader, the absolute authority to whom people go for help and protection.
Then we get the expansion to Elohim.
Elohim is linguistically fascinating because it is grammatically a plural noun. But when referring to the true God in the Hebrew text, it almost always takes a singular verb.
Critical scholars tried to argue this was a clumsy remnant of early polytheism.
But Vos argues it is an intentional plural of majesty, or plural of intensive magnitude. It expresses fullness and richness of being.
It is the God whose power extends simultaneously in every possible direction.
Encompassing all the powers that the pagans divided among their various pantheons.
And then we get to the signature name for the patriarchal period, specifically for Abraham, El Shaddai. Why did Abraham specifically need this name?
Vos derives Shaddai from a Hebrew verb meaning to overpower or to destroy. So El Shaddai is the overpowerer, the all-powerful one who subdues nature.
God uses this specific name in this era because the entire patriarchal narrative requires God to constantly overpower the laws of nature in the service of his grace, right?
Exactly. Abraham and Sarah are physically too old to have children. Nature says they will die childless. But El Shaddai overpowers the deadness of Sarah's womb.
He protects this tiny, vulnerable family against massive, hostile empires.
The name El Shaddai is introduced exactly when Abraham's psychology needs to shift from relying on natural probability to relying entirely on supernatural intervention.
It expresses how God uses nature to serve supernature.
Beautifully put.
So we know who God is talking to, we know they are historical figures, and we know the names he uses to define his power. But how does he actually communicate?
The text notes a major shift here.
God isn't walking in the garden in the cool of the day anymore. Revelation becomes more private, more specialized. It often happens at night through visions and dreams.
Now, earlier we touched on the idea of God wanting pure allegiance. How do dreams fit into that? Why not just appear in broad daylight?
That's a great question.
Vos provides a deep psychological analysis of why dreams become a primary vehicle for revelation here. The text suggests that dreams were often utilized when the receiver's conscious spirituality was immature or at a low ebb.
Think about how the human mind works when awake. The active, conscious personality is full of its own biases, fears, ego, and sinful inclinations.
In a dream state, the consciousness is somewhat detached from that active personality.
Right. If we use a modern analogy, the awake human mind is like a radio receiving a dozen different stations at once. There's so much static from your ego, your anxiety, your daily tasks.
God uses the sleep state to turn down all that human static, so his pure frequency can come through without the receiver's own biases distorting the message.
That's an excellent way to conceptualize it. The dream state essentially neutralizes the unfit, sinful personality of the receiver, allowing them to be a purely passive, receptive vessel for the divine message.
But dreams are only one method. This patriarchal period also introduces one of the most mysterious, heavily debated elements in the entire text.
The angel of Jehovah.
We see this being appear to Hagar in the wilderness, to Abraham, to Jacob.
And this being creates a massive theological paradox. He speaks for God as a messenger, but he also speaks as God. He says, I will multiply thy seed, not God will multiply thy seed.
It's completely wild. He accepts worship, he dictates terms, but he's called an angel.
How does the Wellhausen Critical School handle this paradox? Because it seems to break all the rules of their evolutionary model of religion.
The critical theory attempts to solve this paradox by claiming it was a later deistical edit by scribes.
Deistical edit.
Deism is the belief in a distant, uninvolved creator. The theory argues that as Israelite religion evolved into a more sophisticated monotheism, later Jewish writers became uncomfortable with the older, primitive stories where God was walking around in the dust.
Talking to humans like a regular person.
Right. They felt it was unworthy of a transcendent deity. So, the theory goes, they edited the texts, they invented an intermediate being, an angel, to do the dirty work of interacting with the physical world, keeping God safely distant in heaven.
But Vos completely rejects that deistical edit theory, and his logic here is really sharp.
It is. Vos points out that if the goal of these supposed later editors was to keep God and the creature safely apart, they did a remarkably terrible job.
Because while they introduce an angel, they let that angel speak exactly as God.
Act as God and receive the worship of God, thereby blurring the lines completely all over again.
Instead of a clumsy edit, Vos views this as a profound, intentional revelation of a real manifoldness within the inner life of the deity himself.
He sees it as the Old Testament prefiguration of the Trinity and the Incarnation.
So it's not a downgrade of God's presence. It's an upgrade in how humanity is being trained to understand his complex nature.
Precisely. Vos argues the angel of Jehovah served a dual purpose in the patriarchal era. First, it had a sacramental intent.
Meaning what?
Human beings, being physical creatures, crave the tangible, localized, close presence of God. The angel provided that face-to-face assurance. They could literally see and hear him.
And the second purpose?
Second, it had a spiritualizing intent. By having an angel who is functionally God, but who also refers to Jehovah in the third person, it teaches a complex lesson.
While God can manifest himself locally and physically, his true ultimate essence remains transcendently beyond any physical form.
It perfectly preserves both his intimate closeness and his infinite, uncontainable spirituality.
That is heavy, but it makes so much structural sense. It balances the human need for localized comfort with the theological reality that you are interacting with the uncontainable creator of the universe.
So if this is how the overpowerers spoke, we have to look at what the patriarchs were required to do in response to these visitations.
And the primary requirement God demands of Abraham is a radical, almost absurd new concept: faith.
But we need to define this, because modern culture has reduced faith to just believing something exists without evidence.
That is not what Voss is talking about.
Not at all. The psychology of faith in the patriarchal narrative goes far beyond mere intellectual assent to a set of facts.
The specific Hebrew phrasing used when the text says Abraham believed in the Lord literally implies developing assurance in Jehovah.
Or building oneself upon him. Vos defines it as a profound trust rest.
A trust rest, meaning you stop striving, you lean your entire weight on the object.
Exactly. It means Abraham was required to rely entirely on God's supernatural power, relying on El Shaddai, while completely abandoning his own human ingenuity, resources, and timing.
And Vos notes that we see Abraham repeatedly fail at this initially.
The most glaring example is his attempt to use his wife's servant, Hagar, to produce an heir, Ishmael.
Abraham believes the promise that he will have a son, but he lacks the trust rest. He tries to synergistically help God out using natural human means.
He tries to force the timeline.
But God completely rejects that synergistic approach. He tells Abraham, no, the fulfillment of this covenant must be entirely of grace and entirely supernatural.
Abraham actually has to wait until his body is, as the New Testament later puts it, as good as dead.
Until Sarah is decades past childbearing age, so that the birth of Isaac is undeniably a miracle of the overpower, not a result of human biology.
And as a physical marker of this total reliance, God institutes the rite of circumcision.
Now, it's important to note that many surrounding ancient tribes practice some form of circumcision, usually as a coming-of-age ritual or a tribal badge.
But Vos argues that God appropriates this physical act and infuses it with a radically new theological meaning for Abraham.
Yes, because it deals specifically with the organ of propagation. It isn't just a tattoo on the arm. What is the deeper symbol here?
Vos states that because the rite dealt with the origin of human life, it carried a profound theological symbol about human depravity.
It symbolized that human nature is corrupt at its very source.
It taught Abraham and his descendants that mere physical descent from Abraham wasn't enough to inherit the spiritual promises of the covenant. The physical generation was tainted.
The cutting away of the flesh symbolized that the heart itself must be purified by God. It was a physical act pointing relentlessly to a spiritual necessity.
Which sets the stage for the absolute ultimate test of Abraham's trust rest.
The sacrifice of Isaac in Genesis 22. Before we get into the horrific details of that test, I want to talk about how Vos categorizes Isaac's personality. He uses a really fascinating literary term.
He calls Isaac the amphimaser.
What does that mean?
It's a brilliant term borrowed from Greek poetry. An amphimaser is a specific metrical foot consisting of a short, unstressed syllable sandwiched between two long, stressed syllables.
In the grand rhythm of redemptive history, Vos sees Isaac as that short, passive middle stage.
Abraham represents the massive, dynamic, creative beginning, the first long beat. Jacob, who we will discuss next, represents the highly active, complex, subjective internal struggle, the second long beat.
Isaac is the quiet, passive sufferer in the middle. His life is characterized not by dramatic action, but by patient endurance and submission.
And his most famous moment in the narrative is entirely passive.
Allowing himself to be bound on the altar on Mount Moriah by his father. Now, we have to pause here because when modern readers look at Genesis 22, they recoil.
It's a very difficult passage.
When God asked Abraham to take his beloved son, carry him up a mountain, and slit his throat as a burnt offering, the modern mind screams, how is this not just a reflection of barbaric, ancient, Near Eastern human sacrifice?
How is this God any different from the Canaanite gods who demanded child sacrifice to ensure a good harvest?
Right. It's the most crucial moral question in the Genesis narrative, and Vos addresses it directly by analyzing the internal theology of the event.
He argues that there is absolutely no trace of pagan nature worship or bloodlust here.
In pagan systems, human sacrifice was utilitarian. It was tied to the cycles of nature, literally feeding the gods with blood to ensure crop fertility or victory in war.
God's command to Abraham has nothing to do with manipulating nature. Instead, Genesis 22 is a highly calculated, dramatic event designed to establish the bedrock theological principle of vicarious atonement.
Vicarious atonement, let's break that down. Meaning substituting one life for another to satisfy justice.
Exactly. Vos argues that the narrative was designed to burn two profound truths into the consciousness of Abraham and the future nation of Israel. First, it established the necessity of offering life for sin.
That repairing the catastrophic breach between a holy God and sinful humanity requires the ultimate surrender of life. Sin is that serious.
But second, and most importantly, it establishes the principle of substitution.
God stays Abraham's hand at the absolute last second and provides the ram caught in the thicket.
It was a profound, lived-out lesson that God demands a life, but in His grace, He will accept a substitute.
Vos argues this event was actually a definitive condemnation of actual human sacrifice.
While permanently preserving the spiritual truth that true atonement requires a life to be given.
That changes the entire reading of the text. It's not an endorsement of human sacrifice. It's the exact historical moment God provides the theological alternative to it.
He pushes Abraham to the brink to prove that pure allegiance is required, but then reveals that God Himself will provide the lamb.
So Abraham represents justification by faith. Isaac represents passive substitutionary sacrifice. That leaves us with the third patriarch, Jacob.
Jacob represents the final step in this era, subjective internal transformation.
And man, does Jacob need transforming. He is a total mess.
He certainly is. And this is where Vos highlights the profound doctrine of unmerited grace. The text explicitly points out that Jacob was chosen by God over his older twin brother Esau before they were even born.
Before either had done any good or evil.
Vos argues this is the ultimate proof that divine grace is completely unmerited. Election is not a reward for good behavior or moral superiority.
Jacob's entire life proves this because his natural character is deeply flawed. He is calculating, a deceiver, and a supplanter.
He literally buys his starving brother's birthright for a bowl of soup, then dresses up in animal skins to con his blind father into giving him the blessing.
He's a grifter. And because of his cons, he has to flee for his life, and he ends up in exile. But it's in this exile that the trust has to be forged into him.
He has two massive encounters with God. The first is at Bethel, the famous vision of Jacob's ladder.
Yes. While fleeing, he sleeps with a stone for a pillow, and in a dream he sees a ladder or a staircase reaching from earth to heaven, with angels ascending and descending on it.
Vos notes that this vision serves a vital, immediate theological purpose for Jacob's psychology. In the ancient mindset, gods were strictly territorial.
They were bound to shrines in specific lands. When you left a land, you left its god behind.
Jacob, fleeing Canaan, likely feared he was leaving Jehovah's jurisdiction. But at Bethel, Jehovah assures Jacob that his presence isn't locked to a geographic shrine.
The angels are actively ministering to him even as a fugitive in exile. God's grace and protective power are omnipresent. They follow him.
It's God saying, "My jurisdiction covers the entire board."
But knowing God is there isn't the same as being transformed by him. That transformation happens decades later on his way back to Canaan at his second great encounter at Peniel.
He is alone at night by the Jabbok River, terrified that his brother Esau is coming to murder him.
And a man appears, and Jacob literally wrestles with him until daybreak. Again, secular critics have a field day here.
They argue this is just an old Canaanite myth about a physical wrestling match with a river demon guarding the crossing.
And Vos rejects the river demon myth entirely, focusing on the spiritual mechanics of the text. He outlines a much deeper, integrated interpretation.
He acknowledges the physical reality of the wrestling, but insists it was primarily a profound spiritual struggle. Jacob wasn't fighting out of arrogant rebellion against God.
Remember, Jacob is terrified of Esau. He is wrestling an agonizing prayer for the forgiveness of his past sins and for God's protection.
When the mysterious wrestler touches Jacob's hip and permanently cripples him, it wasn't a dirty fighting tactic to make him stop.
It was a spiritual object lesson designed to force Jacob to stop relying on his own physical, deceptive strength.
Crippled, he can no longer wrestle. He can only cling. He must rely entirely on God in faith. He overcomes divine displeasure through heroic, persistent, clinging faith.
He refuses to let go until he is blessed. He says, "I will not let thee go, except thou bless me."
And because of that clinging faith, his name is changed. He goes from Jacob, the supplanter and con artist, to Israel, the one who wrestles with God and prevails.
And that internal subjective transformation of the man Israel seamlessly sets the stage for the birth of the nation of Israel.
Vos concludes this patriarchal journey by summarizing the massive shift that occurs as the narrative moves toward Moses.
The seed has grown from an individual to a family to a clan, and now it must become a nation.
Vos stresses that Moses is not merely a political leader or pragmatic lawgiver. He's the preeminent prophet who brings the patriarchal promises to their incipient fulfillment.
Moses is the instrument used to forge Israel into a theocratic nation, lead them toward the promised land, and set up the ultimate ideological cosmic conflict between the true religion of Jehovah and the highly developed paganism of the Egyptian Empire. Wow, what an incredible journey. When you follow Vos's organic architecture, you see the progression from the seed form of the tree of life in Eden through the particular, completely unmerited election of one highly flawed, messy family, to the dawn of a massive nation standing on the edge of the Red Sea under Moses.
The organic growth of this tree, the way the theology naturally branches out and deepens at every stage without contradicting its roots, is just staggering to look at when you finally step back.
It truly reveals a unified, purposeful architecture beneath stories that people so often read merely as disjointed fables or isolated moral lessons.
Vos demands that we see the timeline as a single, deliberate masterpiece.
And that brings us to the end of our deep dive today. But before we sign off, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought to mull over.
A final takeaway.
Right. We spent this time talking about Vos's concept of progressive revelation, the idea that complex truth grows organically like a seed into a massive tree. Think about that not just as an ancient historical or theological framework, but as a mirror for how we, as individuals, learn complex truths in our own lives today.
This is very applicable.
We almost never get the full, overwhelming picture of reality all at once. We couldn't handle it if we did. Instead, we are given seed forms, basic principles, early mentors, initial struggles, and sometimes even arbitrary rules that test our discipline.
Those seed forms organically grow and expand as our psychological and emotional capacity to understand deepens.
Look at your own life right now. What seed form truths, what basic foundational principles are currently growing in you, just waiting to branch out and become a fully realized worldview?
That is a brilliant question and definitely one worth wrestling with.
It really is. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep digging.